I'm in the way again. So I'm...
Try the other side.
Yes, bend it. There you go.
So I'm a quarter of the Canary team, so there's 4 of us, and we've decided to call ourselves Canaries. One of us is British, which is me, and the other 3, 2 of which are here, Harel Shapira and Kasim Shepherd, are Americans, and we've got another American colleague, Michael Macquarie, who works at the LSE, so he's not here at the moment. So what I'm going to do today, Ray, is just introduce you to some research that we've been doing as 4 of us in the unlikely place of the East Midlands in the United Kingdom. And I say it's unlikely just because the East Midlands in the UK is one of those places that no one really knows about. No one knows anything about it, and actually they don't even know it exists. So if I was to say to you the East Midlands in the UK...
Isn't the Black Earth area black?
No.
No?
No, I know you're the Black Country.
Black Country.
You're thinking about the Black Country, which is the West Midlands.
That's West, well, it's
Yeah.
Midlands, right?
Yeah, it's Midlands. So the East Midlands is one of those, it's a place really that, you know, if we were going to talk about it in academic ways, you know, it's an under-researched area. It's a place that when we think about industrialisation or we think about working class lives, you wouldn't necessarily think about the East Midlands. You'd think about the north of England. You'd think about perhaps the inner cities, in our big cities. You know, that's where you'd probably think about industrialisation and working class life and culture. So we decided to do the East Midlands, and the idea around the East Midlands was came out of, I suppose, the 2016 Brexit result. After 2016, the 2016 Brexit result, I'm from Nottingham, which is one of the key cities in the East Midlands, and I was spending a lot of time up in Nottingham. And I noticed that there'd been, well actually for 30 years I've noticed that there'd been a shift in politics. So the East Midlands had traditionally been this sort of Labour, which would be your Democrats, neighbourhood area, well, kind of, yeah, area, that was traditionally Labour. And there was sort of movements being made, especially within the old coal mining areas. The East Midlands, Nottinghamshire, was a highly productive part of the coal industry. In fact, it was the most productive coal fields in the whole of the UK. And when it closed, which was in the early 90s, it was still highly productive. The reasons that the mining industry in the UK closed was more political rather than about productivity. So the people who live in the East Midlands in Nottinghamshire are fully aware that they are living on top of millions and millions of tonnes of coal. They're fully aware that their industry closed down because of political reasons rather than for matters of production. So from the early 90s, the coal industry was closed. And this part of the UK had been pretty much left almost to rot for about 10 to 15, 20 years. And the consequences of that has been sort of a shift in culture, a shift in sort of political culture, social networks, but also in employment as well. And I know that this is familiar to you in the US, because you have areas in the US which have been de-industrialized. And so these narratives of sort of loss are very common. So, and then after the 2016 Brexit result, which the East Midlands voted overwhelmingly to leave the EU, and I got a little bit of money from the LSE to do some sort of preliminary research. And I found that the reasons why the working class people in the East Midlands voted to leave was very complicated. It wasn't a simple narrative of sort of around immigration or xenophobia or sort of the Little Englander. it was much more complicated, and it was based on sort of 30 years of history of being de-industrialised, but perhaps another 100 years of history of a mining industry and a trade union history that had been sort of chipped away at over a long time. So I realised that, and then in January 2017, obviously Donald Trump was elected here, and I was talking to colleagues, one of my colleagues at the LSE, my colleague's not here, and we were talking about the similarities of the Donald Trump election and the Brexit election, but also the differences, because we recognised that this was not like for like, you know, that people, working class people in the US did not vote Trump for exactly the same reasons as people in the UK had voted Brexit. So we were talking about similarities, but also the differences. And so we decided to do some research. So we enlisted these two lovely men here at the front, who are creatives and ethnographers and filmmakers. And so what we wanted to do is give a more rounded view of what was happening I suppose in working class communities, but we set it in Nottinghamshire. And so last year, December, my American friends came to Nottinghamshire. So this presentation really is about our time in Nottinghamshire. And what I did is took, well, I wouldn't say they're traditional American boys. I wouldn't say that, you know. But, you know, I took, I would say, two American academics who are very sort of city-driven, and I took them to the outposts of the UK in the mining villages. That's obviously not very American. So these, all the images that I'm going to show you today are Kasim's images that he took while he was there. So if there's any questions, I'm sure you can also point them here as well. Because this is the place I grew up in, so I know this place. And so for me it was really important that I'd got this other view, because I wanted to know what other people thought. Now I thought, and this is where I suppose I'm going to talk, I thought that there was a lot of similarities between the UK and the US. And I thought that the Rust Belt in the US was pretty much what we'd got in the UK in the old mining communities. The great thing actually about bringing some colleagues from America in was very quickly they told me that this was not the case, that these communities were absolutely very different from the Rust Belts, because when they came they expected sort of devastation and nothing, and places that were seeping out its population, places that were also being depopularised as well as being deindustrialised. But actually what they found, and what I already knew, but I probably, again, this is the great thing about sociology and ethnography, is it makes you aware of the things that you already know, but it allows you to think about them differently. I already knew that this place was a very busy place, but I just probably didn't understand why. And that's why it was great having colleagues over, because when they first got there, they said, hang on a minute, this is a really busy place. There's cars all over the roads. You know, there's trucks and lorries. And actually, you know, one day we went round and we looked at number plates of lorries, and we found that there were lots of Romanian and Polish number plates. And so in this part of the country, there was not just lots of movement within the UK, there was also lots of movement throughout Europe as well. So I think that was one of the great things. So this is, one of the things that we were interested in, really, is this movement in space, and the way that this particular space in the UK, over perhaps 30 years, has moved from an industrial place, a place that had got a pit, a mine, every mile. And one of the things we did is we drove really from where all the pits used to be. And I'll show you some of the sort of memorials that we have to the pits. So there would have been a pit every single mile in this sort of 20-mile radius in this place. Now there's none. something like 500,000 jobs in the area had been lost in 10 years. Because it wasn't just jobs for men that had gone. At the same time, women's jobs had gone as well, because in this particular part of the UK, there was a heavy manufacturing industry around hosiery, and all the Marks and Spencers, the sort of traditional middle-class English brand, all the knickers, all the underwear was made in this particular part of the country. In '92, Marks and Spencers changed its policy, which was a policy that everything had to be made in England, in Britain, to become more competitive, which basically meant that their policy was then to send work abroad. So at the same time that the mines were closing down, the factories for women were closing down as well. So it's very difficult to get numbers, actually, how many jobs were lost, because we know how many jobs were lost from the mining industry, which was about 30,000, and that was over 5 years, actually. But then the knock-on jobs, the amount of small workshops that were open around, very difficult to get numbers on, but also the women's jobs, really impossible, because although there was large factories that were making tights and underwear, there's also lots of small workshops as well. But we do think that the knock-on effect really was regional, and almost half of the population lost their jobs in 10 years. So what happened then? Well, from about 92, 93, these communities were they were left, they were abandoned. And I think if I'd taken Kasim, Morel and Michael there then, they might have recognised this as more of a Rust Belt feel, because this is when they were declining. But in 2018, something has happened to this part of this region. And it's probably only in the last sort of 7 or 8 years. So the East Midlands, and it's very important that we sort of think about whereabouts in the country the East Midlands is, which is right in the middle. And it's sort of 2-3 hours from everywhere, because Britain is a very small country. And so logistically, you can get to anywhere from the East Midlands within 2 or 3 hours. So what has happened over the last 8 years is this part of the country has been used as a warehouse. So the whole of the, I don't know really, the whole of the area is like one great big logistics centre. And this is what actually my colleagues pointed out to me. And so this is a photograph of a road. And Kasim was really obsessed with the roads. He loved the roads. You did, didn't you? You loved those roads. And he took loads and loads.
Love is a strong word.
He took lots of photographs of the roads. He also liked Asda as well. So for the English here, it's Walmart. Because also what had happened here as well is the high streets, the small villages, had closed down, but the big Walmarts and the big Tesco's had come in. What has also happened is, in order for this to be sort of the logistical part of not just the UK actually, but Europe as well, is lots of new A roads has had to be built. And so there's been millions and millions and millions of pounds worth of infrastructure gone into this part of the country. But the infrastructure is for lorries and warehouses and not for people. So one of the things that we found is that by car or lorry you can get to the warehouses, but actually getting into the villages where people lived was quite an American model, wasn't it? That the public transport was sketchy at best, and non-existent in some places, and in some places was absolutely declining, to the point where, you know, there was one bus a day out, but you couldn't come back. And actually, you know, one of the reasons actually my dad gave me when my dad voted Brexit, one of the things that he was really unhappy about was the public transport. and the bus that he had been cut from 2 a day to 1 a day, which basically meant he could go out but he couldn't come back. And you know, and I remember sort of telling people at the university, at the LSE, this story, and they were horrified, saying that, you know, these people have ruined our lives because of a bus. They voted Brexit over a bus. They've ruined our lives over a bus. And so, so really, the research that we're doing, because we're still ongoing with this, I think it became more important because you can look at it in those really small terms, that because of a bus, you know, a million bankers' lives have been ruined in London. But because, you know, because of a bus. But
was it East Midlands bus?
Yes, it was an East Midlands bus, yeah. But the, you know, the wider implications here is really about what I've sort of started to call this system of exploitation, which was sort of leaving a place to rot. And then, you know, when it's ripe for plucking, you know, you've got businesses, you've got exploitative businesses like Amazon, Sports Direct, have gone in there, and then they've exploited both, I suppose, the local councils that are desperate to get work in there, exploited the workforce, but also exploited the natural resources of that area as well, which basically it's in the centre of the country. So these are sort of all of the roads that have been built, and we've called them, you know, the roads to the M1, the roads out, because that's literally what they are. They're roads that have been built from warehouses to the M1, and the M1 is the main artery throughout the UK, which leads the north to London. So all roads really here leads to London, and it's about moving warehousing goods, nothing that is made actually here, out. So, and Casima's very nicely done.
Why don't I
am I?
move them around and
Yes.
depending on what you're saying, I
Yes.
show the image you need. This is the M1.
This is the M1.
These are the A roads you just described.
Oh, that's good.
And then
You're in the way.
go for it.
Right. So this is so this is one of the old mines. This is Plesley, and this is what's left of it actually. This is Shirebrook, the Shirebrook colliery. It was one of the mines. Just hold on to that. Actually, we'll keep going. So what's dotted around the landscape is these sort of memorials to where the mines were. And so some of them are quite grand, like this one, which is Newstead Colliery. But then if you go back to Shirebrook, then there's this one, which is quite rubbish and pathetic, really. You know, to say that actually Shirebrook was one of the sort of, it was one of the areas of struggles in the miners' strike. You know, 50% of the miners in this village were on strike and 50% were scabbing. And actually they were, you know, miners were burnt out of their homes. So in this particular area, there's a lot of working class history here. And this is what's been left. And it's quite rubbish. Interestingly enough, I mean, in Newstead, which is one of the villages, you know, there's something much grander and more respectful. Interestingly enough, where Shirebrook mine was, is now sitting right on top of that site, the Sports Direct site, which we visited, and we did some ethnographic shopping there. Did you know that? And Sports Direct, it's 4 miles long. It's a warehouse that there's recently had to be a judicial review about its wages and conditions. 3 women have given birth in the toilets there because they don't have a day off. It pays below the minimum wage, which is illegal.
You have to wait in a queue to be searched at the end of a shift.
Yeah. You have to, and because it's 4 miles long, one of the things that the workers have to do is they have to wait to be searched to go in, but they have to clock in where they work. So some of them have to walk 3 miles after being searched. And this has always been this is interesting to me, the relationship to the miners, because one of the things that the miners used to do, and the trade unions actually stopped that, was, you know, sort of 70 years ago, miners would have to walk to their place of work before they got paid. And that could be 3 miles underground. And now we've got this warehouse on top of where the mines were, sort of 70 years later, with the same sort of working conditions. And so for me, there is something here about this system of exploitation that, you know, while I've been here, I've been reading Mark Twain. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but Mark Twain said, or is supposed to have said, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that's kind of what is happening here. It's this rhyming. So it's not the same, it's not history repeating itself, but there is something very similar between the exploitation of the early mining type days and now the exploitation in the warehouses. So what we also did is we talked to lots of people as well. This is one of a couple actually that we spoke to. They lived in one of the mining communities. It's me with mad hair. And these are people that families all worked down, who would have worked down the mines, and probably they would have done. Now working in the new warehouses, so the younger people working in the new warehouses, working in the new industries. And these are exploitative industries. You know, there's no doubt about it that these are industries that are not offering value of identity. You know, they're not offering value in economic terms. And actually, this whole area is a place of low value. So house prices are low value, land is low value, people are low valued. And I think this speaks, and one of the things that I hope we're going to look at is how this speaks to that wider question in sociology, is that now we've got spaces of low value, but if you contrast that to, say, London, which is a high value space, that England is a good example of this because it's so small. So you've got spaces of high value for high value people, and actually then there's spaces of low value for low value people. And in my previous work, where I've looked at working class experiences in London of being gentrified out, one of the really important things is that working class people who live in London are being moved out to these sorts of low value areas. And so now it's almost like we're matching the low value people to the low value area. And so I'm going to leave it there. That's my dad showing. That's a good picture.
Good one to end on. Loyal to the last.
Yeah, and that's my dad with one of his badges. He showed everybody his badges. And it's sad, it's quite sad really, because his badge says loyal to the last. And he was loyal to the last because when he was on strike in 1984-85 miners' strike, he was one of 15 men who was still on strike on the last day. And that was out of 1,000 men. So as his pit, he was loyal to the last.
Which pit?
Silver Hill. But I think this has got a much sadder message now with what has happened in this part of the country, and actually to working class people in general in the UK and perhaps in the US as well. Is, you know, I'm not sure now what their loyalty means and where it is. And I think that speaks to sort of the wider politics. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.